In this video, we go over Azure Automanage. Hello everyone, I'm Travis and this is Seraltos. One of the advantages to moving to cloud computing is that much of the responsibility for managing the underlying platform goes to the cloud provider, leaving you to manage the service itself. But that story is a little nuanced. The level of management will depend on the type of services you deploy. Management responsibilities are different for software as a service compared to infrastructure as a service. On the screen is the shared responsibility model published by Microsoft. For infrastructure as a service or IaaS, Microsoft takes care of the underlying physical aspects of the service, but the OS, networking, and applications are the responsibility of the customer. This includes things like backups and OS patching. That point has been an obstacle for some organizations to move to Azure. Most organizations have configuration management, logging, monitoring, backups, and update management in their on-premises environment. But extending that to Azure can add costs. Also, one reason for moving to the cloud is to avoid extending those services into Azure. That brings us back to Azure Automanage. Automanage simplifies IaaS server management by applying a set of best practices and automating the day-to-day management of Azure servers. It follows the Azure Cloud Adoption Framework to take care of key security and reliability items. I need to give Microsoft credit for this in the previous image. Here's what you get with Azure Automanage: Azure Backup, Azure Security Center, Azure Monitoring and Log Analytics, Configuration Management, Change Tracking and Inventory, Azure Automation, and Update Management. An item I noticed right away is that Update Management only works with a server OS, not a client OS. And sure enough, the first requirement for Azure Automanage is a Windows Server VM, not a Linux VM and not a Windows client like Windows 10 Multi-User, used for Windows Virtual Desktop. That's unfortunate because updating Windows Virtual Desktop session hosts is a question I get a lot from users. For the other prerequisites, the VM must be running in a supported region. A list of regions supported while in preview is on the screen. You must have contributor rights to the resource group containing the VMs. To enable Automanage, you need the owner or contributor and user access administrator roles. Let's talk about profiles and preferences next. There are two profiles available for Automanage at the time of recording. These are Azure VM Best Practices Production and Azure VM Best Practices Dev Test. There are two profiles because best practices will differ between production and dev test. You probably don't need to back up dev test. This allows you to use Automanage on dev test servers while removing costs for unnecessary services. Currently, those are the two supported profiles. Preferences allow us to make adjustments to profiles. These adjustments must be within the upper and lower range of Azure best practices. We couldn't, for example, disable backups on production VMs. That would be outside the limitations of best practices. Let's review the participating services quick. VM Insight monitoring is only supported for the production profile with no preferences supported. Backup is only supported for the production profile and supports preferences. Azure Security Center is supported for both profiles and does not support preferences. Microsoft Anti-Malware is supported for both profiles and supports preferences. Update Management is supported for both profiles and does not support preferences. And just like Update Management, Change Tracking and Inventory, Azure Guest Configuration, Azure Automation Account, and Log Analytics Workspace are supported for both profiles and don't support preferences. With only two profiles and two services that support modifications with preferences, that may seem a little limiting. This took me a little time to understand, but here's how I see it. Microsoft offers Automanage as a way to verify IaaS VMs meet the Cloud Adoption Framework best practices and prevents drift from those practices. They can't verify compliance if someone decides to disable update management or change tracking. If you only want a subset of services, say backup and update management, you can still use those services independent of Automanage. Up next, we're going to walk through onboarding a VM through the portal and then review settings with a VM I added a couple days ago. Let's get started in the portal. Here I am signed in as a subscription owner. To get started, we'll go to All Services and search for Automanage. There it is. You can see it's in preview. I already have Automanage enabled on one VM. Let's enable it on another. We'll go to Enable on Existing VM. Let's start at the top by selecting a machine. Here it shows my subscription. It's using all resource groups, although I could narrow it down to a specific resource group. It's also only showing eligible VMs. You can select this box to show all VMs. Notice some of them are marked as ineligible. Either the VM's not running, it's already been configured, or it's in a location that's not supported. I'll uncheck that and select the VM to enable. Click Select. Let's go to Configuration Profile. And notice we have two of them. We have the Dev Test and then the Production. And if you notice, Virtual Machine Insights and Backup are listed on Production, and they're not on the Dev Test. That's because Backups and Insight is not included on Dev Test. Let's go back to Production, and we can use the default preference, or we can create a new one. Let's create a new preference. There's no spot to add a resource group, so if you want to add these to their own resource group, you'll need to create that beforehand. I'll select my Automanage resource group. Oh, and I guess you have to give it a name. I'll call this one Seraltos 30-Day. Notice it select the region that resource group was in. Now we have two options for preferences. And keep in mind that if you selected Dev Test, Backup would not be in here. So let's go to Backup. Here we have settings for the backup. I'm going to configure this to backup at 1 a.m. And we'll change the time zone. We'll set it to Central Time, US and Canada. There's an option for Instant Restore. Instant Restores take a snapshot as part of the backup with a 1 to 5 day retention for a faster recovery. I'll leave this set to 2. And then under Backup Retention, I'll change that from 180 days to 30. I'll close that. Let's look at anti-malware next. This has the standard options for file locations, extensions, and process exclusions. This is helpful if you're enabling Automanage on, say, a SQL server or another application that requires antivirus exclusions. There's an option to enable or disable real-time protection, disable or enable scheduled scans, set the scan type and the scan day and the amount of time it's allowed to run. You can disable real-time protection and scheduled scans, leaving only on-demand scans. That seems like a bad idea to me, but you can do it. I'll turn that back on. Once it's ready, click Create to finish. Make sure a new preference is created, and then click Select. If we go to Advanced, we can create a new Automanage account. We'll leave this as it is. Once the server is selected and the configuration profile is set, click Enable to onboard the VM. You can see now in Automanage I have one that's configured and one that's in progress. They both have different configuration preferences. They're very similar, only the first one has real-time protection disabled. The first VM was onboarded a couple days ago and shows as configured. But there's not a lot of other information from here. Let's click on the VM and see additional details. That just takes us to the VM. Good, but I was hoping to see a status of all the participating services. We can go through each individually. And as a reference, this is a new VM. I haven't configured any services other than Automanage. Let's go to Insights first. Under Monitoring, Insights. Here we get information about the VM, including a map, We can make that a little smaller. We can also see information about performance. There's also a health option. I don't have health enabled on this VM, and it's not part of Automanage, so onboarding the VM to Automanage won't configure health. But here we can see some information on the CPU utilization, memory, disk IOPS, and byte sent. Let's move on to backups. If we go to Operations Backup, it shows we have 2 application consistent backups. That's good. Let's move on to Azure Security Center. We'll go to All Services and search for Security and go to Security Center. There's not much to see here. The service will configure the subscription where the VM resides for the free tier of Security Center. If the subscription has Security Center configured, Automanage will not change it. So it's not configuring the server specifically. Automanage enables Security Center on the subscription. Notice that Azure Defender is a premium solution. Microsoft Anti-Malware is a free anti-malware solution. I was not able to see a status of Microsoft Anti-Malware in the Security Center. If we go to Inventory and filter this to VMs, we can see the VMs and their status. Let's go to Automanage Test 1. You can see it showing as monitored. And if we scroll down, it shows 3 Security Center recommendations and 9 past assessments. Let's go back and select a VM that hasn't been onboarded yet. We'll go to Automanage Test 3. This VM shows 7 recommendations with 3 passed. The difference between this one and the previous one is that Automanage onboarded several services that satisfied those recommendations. Let's go back to Automanage. We'll go into the VM that's configured. If we go to Guest plus Host Updates under Operations, we can see the option for Guest OS Updates. There's also a spot that would list host updates if there were any. There are none for this VM right now. Let's go to Update Management. There are no critical or security updates. They were automatically applied. There are some other updates available, but these aren't critical or security updates. I looked all over and could not find a spot to centrally manage the update window. It's tied to active hours on the VM. My VM was set with active hours between 8 a.m. and 5 p.m. Updates happened after 5 p.m. I'm sure setting the active hours could be done through a GPO, but it would be nice to have a central spot for that. Let's look at how we can tell that this VM was updated with change tracking. I'll go back to my VM, and under Operations, go to Change Tracking. Here we can see a list of changes. I'm going to set the time range to the last week. Now if we go down to the log, I'm going to go all the way to the last one. And we'll go maybe the next. Here's where I installed Notepad++. You can see that was tracked in change tracking. And a little bit later, after 5 p.m., it started installing updates. We can also go to Inventory on the VM. From here, we can see the software installed on the server as well as other data. In addition to enabling those services, it also created an Azure Automation account. Here we can see that account. That's used to push the updates to the VM. It also created a Log Analytics workspace. There we can see the workspace it created. That's where all the configuration logs will go to. That's how to onboard a VM to Azure Automanage and review some of the settings that are applied. There's no cost for Automanage during the public preview, but each service, such as Azure Backup or Log Analytics, has an associated cost. Overall, I noticed a lack of control or monitoring with Automanage. I'd like to take a quick glance in the portal and see the service status for each VM without having to drill into other tools. Alerting if one of the VMs falls out of compliance also would be helpful. At this point, the documentation is thin. I had to jump around a lot to find information about each service. That may be because Automanage is a wrapper for those other services. With that said, I like the idea of what Automanage can do. Simply onboard a VM and have the updates, backups, and other best practices applied without having to manage it yourself. I think that has a lot of potential. Keep in mind that Automanage is still in preview and we may see some of these missing items added before it goes GA. Don't let some of the limitations I mentioned prevent you from trying it out. And if you have suggestions, send them to the Azure Automanage feedback page. I'll include a link below. That's it for Automanage. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and thank you for watching.